Live in Washington, D.C. Here in our studio in London is Dr Stacey Gutkowski, a lecturer in conflict studies at King's College London. Thank you very much for coming in. There's been lots of talk about Libya, about Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan. These comparisons are interesting, but are they particularly relevant to what's going to happen with regards to Syria?
Syria is very sui generis in its own way. I mean, in Kosovo, in the Balkans, in Libya, you didn't have the particular strategic quagmire that you have in Syria, with countries that are in the borders who are funneling weapons into Syria and have a very strong military stake in the country. Libya was more isolated, and in the Balkans, it wasn't such a hot zone.
And international law is getting quoted an awful lot today. But again, is that relevant to the outcome? If one country is deemed to have broken international law, some of our viewers may feel that the consequences don't seem obvious.
International law is important to the rhetoric and to the discourse of this potential intervention. You have to remember that in 1988, and then also previously during the war in Iran and Iraq, the West stood by while Saddam Hussein gassed first the Iranians and then the Kurds. There's a strong precedent for taking a stand against chemical weapons. But the most important point, which Mr. Gardner didn't mention, was the fact that there is no taste for this kind of intervention in the region, and that must be taken seriously. And I imagine it is being taken seriously while the U.S. and its allies contemplate potential intervention.
And we've seen the U.S. Navy performing various maneuvers in the last 24, 48 hours. Should we see that as a military action or as a political action?
I think we need to see it as a political action. It's a gesture. U.S. capabilities are well known in the region. This is to send a message to Russia and also to send a message to Israel.
And what's your reading of the different dynamics that we've got at play here? Who do you feel is leading the push for intervention? Is it the White House or David Cameron at number 10 or France? Or where do you see the dynamics playing out at the moment?
Well, there's a push for intervention probably from the European powers, probably from President Hollande and then from David Cameron as well. What the U.S. is probably doing is responding to the needs and desires of its ally Israel, who must be feeling the pressures that are on them in terms of the current peace negotiations with the Palestinians. They'll be receiving intelligence from the Jordanians, from the Israelis as well, from the Turkish intelligence agencies. But then ultimately they'll also be paying attention to what's on the ground.
And there's one other thing, and I alluded this to in my introduction at the beginning of the programme, which is that there's an irony, isn't there? On the day that these inspectors actually get to the site, actually Britain and other countries have started to talk about this attack as if it were a definite event, that there is no longer very much doubt about who carried it out. So how important are the inspectors and what they find?
I think we need to be very wary about the idea that this attack is going to come overnight, because it isn't. Frankly, there's going to be a push to go to the UN to see if there is some level of consensus over this. There's going to be a lot of intelligence gathering going on in terms of how this is going to tip the balance in terms of foreign jihadists in Syria and in the region. And ultimately, the US and the UK and its allies are going to take a careful look at what that actual evidence is. It's likely that this is possibly not sarin gas, not VX gas, but some other sort of biochemical or insecticide weapon that could be used in Syria by the regime, potentially by the rebels, likely not. They don't have the delivery capabilities. But a strike would reduce one factor in the conflict. It wouldn't put an end to the civil war, but it would put an end to the movement of chemical weapons to different hands involved in the conflict.
Thank you very much indeed for coming in. There's Dr. Stacey Gutkowski. Thank you very much.